Hey babies, it's your favorite host, Mr. BMG, back at it again with another episode. Let's get into it. First story I want to get into is the whole Nene Leakes T.S. Madison interview. So as we all know, Nene Leakes has her own show on YouTube titled The Nene Leakes Show, and she basically talks through some hot topics and has interviews with different celebrities catching up on their lives and various issues. And yeah, it's been pretty entertaining so far. I want to get into the meat of, the interview with T.S. Madison. In substance, in my understanding, it was more so Nene Leakes kind of pointing a finger at the men that T.S. Madison would date, and essentially implying the fact that she wouldn't necessarily date the men that T.S. Madison dated because they wouldn't necessarily could be considered straight. I found that pretty problematic, that she would say that she wouldn't date those type of men, because I do feel like, in my opinion, she's kind of taking away T.S. Madison's gender identity. T.S. Madison is a trans woman, and I feel like the way she responded to, or maybe her ignorance within that moment, for me created a bigger conversation about how in the industry that she works in, there are obviously a lot of queer people, and I think she's been exposed to a lot of queer people who may have lent her in some ways an understanding of the politics of being queer, whether it's being gay, whether it's being transsexual, whether it's being transgender, whether, it's being bisexual, many different spectrums of queer people, I'm sure, I feel like have been around her for many, many years. So I feel like I was not expecting the ignorance in which she made the conversation, although I think T.S. Madison was mature enough to make it a teachable moment, and that's where transphobia comes in, because we refuse to accept and appreciate people's gender identity, making it a very difficult space to navigate, or to even have intersectional struggles to come together in times of challenges that bring all the groups of people together, So I think in that circumstance, I just didn't like how she responded. I'm not oblivious to the fact that Nene can be a prude, or has always been a prude in some extent, because every time I've kind of seen her on the Real Housewives of Atlanta kind of engaging in topics related to sex, or, of a raunchy nature, she always kind of gets uncomfortable and acts kind of like holier than thou in those circumstances. I'd say like conversations where maybe Candy would bring them up, or Candy would have an interactive activity where she would be, talking on concepts of sex. She would just kind of act prudish. So this is not the first time I've sort of seen her being weird around topics that she may consider taboo, is what I'm trying to say, because I do feel like inherently and deep down she's probably a very conservative Southern woman. The way she presents herself, being young and happening, and, still relevant. Her views on trans people may not be very relevant, which, I just found so problematic, and I just wish that she would be less of a prude and more engaging on, matters related to trans people. It will become embarrassing if that was maybe somebody else who was not necessarily going to be patient enough with her in that circumstance, in that moment. I don't think it sank in what T.S. Madison was kind of trying to say to her, and so I feel like she'll still continue to be a prude, and still think it's acceptable to even say, such on a public platform. For her platform to be successful, I think she must also take time to research her guests better, so that she doesn't come into those weird circumstances where she's kind of not reading the room on a matter that she should probably be understanding of. You girl, do better. You are that girl, and I need you to be that girl on queer matters, because I know for sure that a lot of people who support Nene Leakes are queer people. So I think she needs to understand the platform that supports her before it cancels her. So I wanted to talk about the Real Housewives of Atlanta seating chart, since we are, speaking about former housewives, and it was an interesting, season 16 reunion seating chart, because it caused a lot of controversy. So on the one side we have Shamia, Angela, Kelly, and then Drew, and then on the one side we have Portia, Phaedra, and Cynthia. And then obviously we have people who are missing. Brit is missing, she's just decided not to show up, and Kenya is missing because she was not invited, or invited then uninvited. And obviously all of this has to do with the Brit Eady saga. As I'm seeing the sort of season develop and progress, the big story of the season, which was happened at the beginning of the season, kind of left a hole within the rest of the season, because it was not concluded. It wasn't concluded on camera on the show, and we only really got to see Brit's side of the story after everything happened, and her sort of campaign to sort of victimize herself in all of that, speaking just to many different people, and essentially almost demanding their sympathy. Because I remember a moment where she was like offended that some of the girls had actually heard Kenya's side of the story and were speaking to Kenya to hear, what happened, because she almost felt entitled to being in the right in that moment, and entitled to everyone's sympathy and entitled to everyone's loyalty, which I found so fucked up, you know, and just unnecessary and annoying. That whole storyline left a hole for the rest of the season because it was not addressed properly, and because it wasn't addressed properly, you know, the way it ended up playing out kind of didn't leave a good impression on the viewers, you know. And so obviously, like, the Real Houses of Atlanta reunion is kind of pointless, you know, because we're not really going to get to the heart of what everyone wants closure on, and that's quite unfortunate. So yeah, the seating chart was a mess. I think Angela Oakley could have sat next to Andy, because when I'm also seeing how the season progressed, it looked like she really came to form with, you know, kind of being the center of attention in some ways, and almost unknowingly becoming the center of attention, which I think that's what the audience likes, you know, when somebody grows on, because she kind of started off quiet. She didn't really start the season off with, like, you know, some crazy heat or a forced storyline. She kind of grew into the show. You know, I'd say her first big moment for me was her sort of back and forth with Shamia, where she kind of read her, and it was just kind of funny, and she kind of grew through you know, having conversations with Portia, and she read Portia. She had conversations with Brit Eady and kind of read Brit Eady as well, but so effortlessly, in a way that's kind of like not really forced, and in some ways is reminiscent. I've heard people saying that she's kind of reminiscent of an old housewife, like the era of, you know, season 1 to 7, Real Houses of Atlanta, of Nene Leakes, of, you know, your Sherees, your Kenyas, you know, your all the old girls who were really like, who defined the culture of the show, Candies and them. There's almost a new school and an old school happening within the rookies. I feel like Kelly and Brit Eady were kind of the more new school, love and hip hop-ish housewives, because they're kind of younger and, you know, popping off in the streets essentially. I'd say Kelly is a lot more, she fits more into the housewives mold, even though she does kind of have a love and hip hop aesthetic to her. She fits more because she seems like a very involved parent and showcases her family events, you know, quite thoroughly, which I think the audience likes. We love to see a family angle, so she fits in that regard with regard to her family dynamic and how she's got a big, you know, a huge amount of people around her. But I would say Angela fits in just in terms of character, demeanor, energy, and what people probably expect to see in the Real Housewives. So yeah, and just in terms of storyline, I think she deserved first seat. Drew Sidora is still struggling with that narcissistic man of hers. Maybe she sat all the way at the end because maybe the network is still angry with her for last season, because I do feel like last season, when she was actually going through her divorce, which she still is, but at the crescendo of it, when it was new and fresh, I feel like she didn't give us much of a story. She could have done a better job of giving us story in season 15 of her relationship with Ralph, but she really didn't do that. And I think because of that, you know, maybe her sitting towards the end is the network punishing her. And I have no beef with her. Like, yes, she could have done a better job of telling us the story in earlier seasons, you know. So her redemption maybe is not received or counts towards her making amends for season 15. So maybe if she continues to give a story in season 17, she will then move closer and closer to Andy, you know. So I think there's a method to the seating chart, and it's definitely not by accident that she sat at the end of the couch. I think there's some maybe retribution that's going on there, which I maybe think is justified. In terms of Portia sitting next to Andy, I do feel like maybe by default it happened because she's the oldest outside of, you know, Kenya, who was there but is no longer there. She's kind of represents the core of the old Atlanta housewives. So I think maybe it was just a respect thing. It would only be right if she sat across. There are obviously people missing on the seating chart, i.e. Kenya and Brit. We would have loved to see the story between her and Kenya get resolved, but it wasn't. Brit posted a story of, you know, basically mentioning the fact that the alleged clips of her that were shown at Kenya Moore hair spa opening, they were actually not of her, and everyone kind of went into shambles about that, because then it's like, well, Kenya got the wrath of all of that, but the pictures weren't actually of Brit, so why was there so much energy towards Kenya and all of that happened in her not being a part of the show when it wasn't even Brit on those pictures, you know? So I think for a lot of people that probably showed that there was like maybe some foul play involved, and because of that it kind of left a bad taste in people's mouth, because it's like, well, everyone went too bad for this girl, but it turns out she was crying wolf. And then Brit Eady goes ahead and allegedly sues the network for allegedly having like an uncomfortable work environment and essentially kind of really putting her in a tricky or shitty position. The irony of it all is I feel like Kenya should be the one suing, you know, for all of the reasons that she's suing for. Bravo needs to take accountability for ruining season 16 also, you know, because now it's kind of like we're having the reunion we didn't want. And the girl who is at the center of the drama didn't come to take accountability at the reunion. The girl who was unfairly treated, Kenya Moore, also was not available to come, or was made unavailable to come. So at the end of the day, they have egg on their face, and that's all on them. So Kenya Moore actually has her own show called Life Twirls On. The reason why that show came about is because she needed a platform to air out her opinions based on the fact that she didn't have confessionals on season 16, but also I think she just wants to make it her own. It's interesting how a lot of people are now having platforms where they are kind of having mini talk shows on their own platforms, like talking about hot topics, talking about other celebrities, or talking with other celebrities. Everyone is doing that. It's actually becoming such a saturated market. I watched the first episode. It's only 30 minutes and it was really good, really entertaining. What I liked though was actually when she talked about her dream cast of the show, and I found that so interesting because some of the people she mentioned, I'm like, yeah! Some of my favorite, names that she mentioned were Monique, Issa Rae, Lisa Ray McCoy, and she also mentioned Vivica A. Fox. And I want to get into those because I feel like those are super important. So Monique, I think, would be a great talent because Monique is funny. I think she would give us great confessionals. And Monique always has a story. I feel like she always has something that she's going through. And if she's a person who's very transparent, I think she'd be able to give us great television. I do feel like she'd probably assume the cast in the sense that she'd probably expect the matriarch title on the show, and that may rub her off with like Nene and those people. I think they may maybe not get along because of that, because Nene will probably think, well, this is my show, and Monique will probably may steal the show because of her charisma, but also there's a lot of depth with her storylines with her children, and her career, and she can also tell all of that through comedy, which is something that captures a lot of people. So I think she would be incredibly great on the show. Lisa Ray McCoy, I saw her on Queen's Court, and I think she was freaking amazing and a very layered woman, Also, she's got a comedic bone to her. Like, she can give you a fun little nightshade read, and she's got the background of being an actress, which I think sometimes makes for a good housewife on the show because they kind of understand the performative element of it as much as you being yourself, With the exception to Kim Fields, I think she was probably one of the actresses that didn't work out as being a great housewife because she just was weak, man. She just didn't know how to stand up for herself, to be honest, on the show, and she didn't really have the personality for it, so it didn't translate. So she's great on the upshows though. I think she's really found what she knows how to do, and I think her being in actual scripted content is much better. So yeah, Monique was Lisa Ray McCoy. I do agree as well. I think she'd be great talent on it, just based off of her energy on Queen's Court. Issa Rae, definitely a quirky one. I'd say that's kind of a wild card because would she even want to be part of the Housewives? I don't think unscripted content is really her thing. I do think she seems like she's got an interesting personality, but I think sometimes people base it off of her character on Insecure, which is that awkward black girl energy, which I think would work, would also be a comedic element to it, and it's kind of like a refresher. She's not necessarily a typical black girl, so I think that would be kind of refreshing in that regard, and I'd love to see that. And then she also mentioned Vivica A. Fox, which I think was probably her best mention because we've seen firsthand Kenya Moore and Vivica A. Fox going at it on The Apprentice, and Vivica knows how to read people. She knows how to read, and it's actually funny, So I think she would be such a great talent on the Housewives of Atlanta. She would be so freaking good. I almost feel like all of those people she mentioned, maybe too much talent to exist on a single season. Like, I almost feel like they need to be spread out into several seasons, and maybe they may not stay on for a very long time and become resident on the show, but that's a lot of energy to put on one season, those few women. But I think even if we just had one of them, I think it would be good for the show. So Mariah Carey released Type Dangerous, I think is the name of her new song. I wasn't expecting new music from Mariah Carey, to be honest, because I just feel like she's kind of in a legacy state where we don't necessarily expect new music from her, but if she does go on tour, if she was to do something, we'd expect her to do all her classic songs, and that could just run into perpetuity forever. So the new music is kind of like a mix of rap and R&B. I am not necessarily feeling it like that. Like, I played it once and it's just not something that I'll be like, oh my gosh, I'm going to play it again, I'll play it again, I'll play it again. Maybe her not releasing new music is the best thing she can do for her career, because if she starts releasing new bodies of work and they really flop, people will only remember you for the last work you gave us. And I think if the last work is a flop, then people start to receive her in that way versus her having left on a high and just keeping it there. Speaking of new music, quite a lot of people are releasing new music. I think it's just because of the spirit of the summer, Everyone's fighting for people's ears. Tyler released the music video for Bliss, which was very interesting. Worked with director X, so obviously that it's a great job. Most of it was shot on a green screen, and it's a great music video per se. Like, obviously it's very much edited, it's a great music video. I'm not really a fan of the song, to be honest. I know sometimes when an artist releases a music video for a song, it kind of maybe changes the perception of the song and either makes people more excited about the song or even less excited about the song. The music video is great. I still don't like the song. I don't think the song is going to be a commercial success per se. I'm more into the When I'm With You song than the Bliss song. It's just not giving. Man Child by Sabrina Carpenter has 11 million views in 2 days. It's not my favorite song. I do feel like Sabrina Carpenter has the pop star position at the moment, the Gen Z pop star girly. So she's that girl, so she's getting the big numbers. I don't think the song is great enough for those numbers, but I think she has a machine under her. So anything she releases, even if she releases a song where she's not saying anything, it will have 20 million views in 2 days, whatever it is. But it's not my favorite song. What I just did notice though about the song is she's just really committed to the whole, slut from the 80s aesthetic. Like that's her whole vibe and mantra, So she's very committed to that slut from the 80s aesthetic. I just was not a fan of the song, and it's just not an espresso like a feather. So Billboard will be launching a Billboard Africa platform, I guess, which is basically will be a string of rankings or chart data related to African musical genres. Obviously this is long overdue. I think it's a great move for Africa because I think people will stop just seeing Africa as Afrobeats, because there are many different genres within, African music. There's also pop music, there's also R&B music, there's also soul music, there's also rap music, and there's also many different genres of music that exist within the African continent that are not just Afrobeats. Afrobeats, they are Afrobeats, but they're not Afrobeats in the sense that, because obviously Afrobeats has become the umbrella term for African music, but I think Billboard having its own chart data and chart rankings will show the diversity of the continent, and will be quite a great stepping stone for African music, and hopefully it will give other artists the platform to grow globally in the music industry to the levels that Tyler has obviously or is continuing to grow into. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see who's going to dominate those lists, but I do have a feeling like your existing things, the ones who are making moves in the global spaces, will probably dominate the African charts in any case, because they have to get the push from the continent for them to be big everywhere else. So naturally they would dominate. So Malia Obama / Malia Ann dropped the Obama piece of her name and just goes by Malia Ann, and apparently, allegedly, it's because she doesn't want to be a Nepo baby, basically. That's really what's going on. I do feel like she can't run away from that, because the fact that now people know publicly that now she goes by Malia Ann, really she's Malia Obama, isn't really going to make people not know who she is, and either want to work with her or not want to work with her because of that, So I think the Nepo baby rebellion is always a thing. I think we see it in a lot of kids who are raised by famous people. I don't really think it's going to work. I think she just owned the fact that she's associated with Obamas. I think maybe it's a heavy burden to carry, because maybe she's forced to be perfect because she's associated to being the former child of the president, so it's a lot of pressure. So I completely understand and get why she may want to distance herself, even if it's just beyond professionally. It may just be tiring to exist, with that name, but I also think she should own it and use it to her advantage. I think she grew up in those circumstances, and her life can only be made easier by the advantages she essentially had growing up. So use the advantage, girl. Like, use it. And if you make a big enough name of yourself and whatever else you're doing, I think people won't necessarily see you as a Nepo baby, because you're not necessarily going into politics. You're not trying to be the next president. You're trying to do something completely different. And I think if you're good enough at what you're doing, and if you still go by that name, by the Obama name, then go by the Obama name, because I don't necessarily think people will compare you to your parents. One, because they were in a completely different genre. They were in politics and you're not trying to be in politics. But I also think if you're just great enough at your craft, nobody will say anything, because your work speaks for itself. Another thing I want to talk about is how Elon Musk and Donald Trump are fighting, and it's kind of becoming messy in the sense that, like, it's involving the public, in the sense that we are seeing it live unfold on X, and it's just like, oh my gosh, what is going on? My personal opinion is that it's all a ruse, and maybe they're not really fighting, and I think allegedly, apparently, their beef is probably maybe orchestrated so that people think that there's discord and between the two, so that maybe Elon can get the valuation of his company is back on track, because it looks like the stocks have been tanking, and a lot of that is because of the association with I feel like the association with Trump and the tariffs and all of that economic chaos that's happening, So I feel like I don't really genuinely believe their beef, and if it is real, it would be very interesting to see what will be revealed, because they're both very petty, and I saw Andy Cohen joking about the fact that he would love to host the reunion, but I also feel like maybe he was talking about the Housewives of Atlanta reunion, because it was, when he tweeted that, it was kind of like on the same day, so the ambiguity of that whole statement kind of became interesting, because the way they were fighting, it's like they needed to be on the Real Housewives and they needed a show to just kind of air out their issues. So yeah, a lot is happening between those two, but I also feel like I'm not buying into the show. I'm not buying into the charades, because I feel like they're both kind of problematic in their own way, and two problematic people fighting doesn't make the one less problematic than the other. They're still both problematic. Anyway, babies, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of The Messiest Bitch on the Internet. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and also follow us on Instagram at BigBunnyEntertainment_, and I'll see you again on the next one.